Have you ever felt your perfect home being invaded, not by strangers, but by someone you thought was part of your life? My husband and I had just moved into our dream house. Everything was perfect. Until his best friend showed up, heartbroken from a long-term breakup. And without even asking me, my sweet husband offered him to stay for months, just because Chris needed a place to heal. Suddenly, I was trapped between helping a friend and protecting the sanctuary I just built with my husband. What would you do if you were me? The morning sunlight filtered through the wide windows of our brand new home, casting golden stripes across the polished wooden floors. Everything smelled faintly of fresh paint and new beginnings. I could hear the distant chirping of birds outside, a soft reminder that life was moving forward in the most perfect way, or at least, that's how it felt when John and I first stepped inside together. Our dream house had been months in the making, every corner meticulously designed, every fixture carefully chosen. From the smooth marble countertops in the kitchen to the soft, cream-colored rugs that lined the living room, it was all exactly how we had imagined. For the first time, I felt like we had a sanctuary that belonged entirely to us. A space where we could begin our life as a married couple without interruption or compromise. John, my husband, had been my anchor through all the chaos of wedding planning and moving. He was sweet, thoughtful, and in his own way, endlessly generous. I loved that about him. He had a tendency to put the needs of others above his own, which was part of what drew me to him in the first place. But sometimes, I wondered if his generosity could tip over into recklessness. That thought returned to me almost immediately as I remembered Chris, John's best friend. I liked Chris. I truly did. He was funny, charming, and could light up a room with his infectious laugh. But he was messy. He had a habit of leaving dishes in the sink, clothes on the floor, and somehow always left a trail of little inconveniences wherever he went. He borrowed things without asking, a tendency that had always made me slightly uneasy. As I moved through the living room, arranging a few final touches, I tried to imagine what it would be like if Chris were actually here, living in this space that was supposed to be ours. The idea made me tense in a way I hadn't expected. I could practically see him sprawling on the couch, leaving coffee cups on the table, tossing his jacket carelessly over the new sofa, and somehow assuming that the home would rearrange itself around him. And then John said it. Chris just broke up with his long-term girlfriend, he said, his voice filled with concern. I think he should stay with us for a few months until he gets back on his feet. I froze. Wait, what? I asked, my voice catching slightly. John looked at me, his eyebrows raised, completely unaware that my heart had just skipped a beat, not from excitement, but from sheer disbelief. Yeah, he said, smiling gently. It's only temporary. He's going through a tough time. Temporary. A few months. Just because Chris needed a place to heal. I felt a sudden swirl of emotions, shock, frustration, and something deeper. A creeping fear that the home we had just built together could turn into a revolving door for someone else's problems. I tried to imagine the next few weeks, the clutter, the constant need to accommodate another person's habits, the subtle but inevitable erosion of our private space. And then I thought, am I being selfish? Shouldn't I want to help a friend in need? But even as I wrestled with that thought, I knew deep down that this was different. This wasn't a weekend guest. This wasn't a temporary favor. This was months of intrusion into a life we had just started building together. And I wasn't ready. Not yet. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. Somehow, I had to figure out how to navigate this without hurting John, without making him feel like I didn't care about his friends, and without surrendering the sanctuary we had worked so hard to create. Little did I know, this moment, the casual offer of a friend in need, would become the first test of our marriage. A test that would challenge my patience, my empathy, and my ability to communicate what truly mattered to me. The next few days passed with a strange tension hanging over our home. Even though Chris hadn't arrived yet, I could feel the shadow of his presence creeping into every corner of our space. Every item I placed carefully, every small detail I polished, seemed to exist in fragile suspense, as if anticipating the chaos he might bring. John, on the other hand, seemed completely unaware of my unease. He hummed as he unpacked boxes in the kitchen, arranging mugs and plates with meticulous care, smiling at the thought of Chris finally having a safe place to stay. He's like a brother to me, John said casually, stacking the last of the utensils. I can't just turn him away when he needs us. I wanted to understand his perspective, I really did. I knew Chris had been through a rough breakup. I had seen him on video calls, sitting silently, staring at nothing, lost in thought. The heartbreak had aged him in ways I couldn't describe, and I knew John felt compelled to act, to provide him shelter. That was who John was: generous, compassionate, and sometimes impulsive. But generosity could be exhausting when it collided with my own needs. I found myself walking from room to room, inspecting our home through a lens of anxiety. The living room, the centerpiece of our new life, looked perfect now, but I imagined it cluttered with dishes, jackets strewn across the sofa, coffee mugs left on side tables, the TV remote constantly misplaced. The kitchen counters, so gleaming and pristine, suddenly seemed vulnerable to the chaos of a man who treated someone else's home like a dorm room. I started to replay every previous encounter I'd had with Chris in my mind. There was that time he borrowed my favorite mug without asking, leaving fingerprints that no one seemed to care about. The afternoons when he dropped by unexpectedly, helping himself to snacks as if he lived there. The constant trail of his belongings left behind whenever he visited John's apartment. Each memory compounded my sense of foreboding, and then, I remembered something that made my chest tighten: the weekends when John and I had friends over, and Chris would leave a pile of plates and glasses on the counter, smiling sheepishly, as if it were no big deal. John had always laughed it off, saying, "He's a little messy, but it's fine. We'll clean it up later." To John, cleaning up after friends was part of life. To me, it felt like surrendering the order and calm I desperately needed. I tried to talk to John about my feelings, tentatively at first. "I know Chris needs help," I said one evening as we stood in the kitchen. "But months in our home? I'm not sure I'm ready for that." John's face fell slightly, not with anger, but with a hint of disbelief. I thought you'd understand. He's been through so much. I can't turn him away." "I do understand," I replied carefully. I don't think I can handle having someone else live here for that long. We've barely started our life together." We stood there in silence, the faint hum of the refrigerator filling the gap. Both of us aware that the conversation had opened a door to conflict neither of us was fully prepared to navigate. As the sunset, painting the walls with soft orange and pink light, I walked through our home again. I traced my fingers along the edge of the kitchen counter, touched the polished wood of the dining table, and imagined Chris moving through these spaces as though they were his own. The thought made my stomach twist in knots. I realized then that this wasn't just about cleanliness or organization. It was about boundaries, about the sacred space of our first home as a married couple. And more than that, it was about respect, mutual respect between John and me, between our needs and the needs of his friends. I didn't know it yet, but these small, creeping anxieties were only the beginning. They were the first whispers of the tension that would grow over the coming weeks. The subtle friction between generosity and privacy, between love for a friend and love for a husband. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I wondered, how much was I willing to compromise before my own sense of home and peace would feel completely lost? It was a Friday afternoon when Chris finally arrived. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves, and the gentle rustle of trees outside made the driveway seem serene. But inside me, a storm was quietly brewing. I had walked through every scenario in my mind, imagining Chris spilling coffee on the couch, leaving socks on the floor, stacking dishes haphazardly, and treating our pristine home as though it were a dorm room. John had greeted him with the warmth of a brother seeing family after months apart. "Chris," he exclaimed, opening the door wide. "You made it." Chris stepped inside, dragging a duffel bag that looked heavier than he was. His hair was slightly disheveled, and his eyes had that weary, post-breakup look: empty, lost, searching. He gave John a half smile, and for a moment, I felt pity. He looked vulnerable, fragile in a way that tugged at anyone's instinct to protect. John immediately began showing him around the house, proud and beaming as if presenting a palace. "This will be your space," John said, pointing to the guest bedroom. "And the living room is open anytime you need to relax." I followed silently, clutching my cup of tea, trying to gauge my own reaction. My throat felt tight. The house felt smaller already. The quiet corners I had cherished invaded before Chris had even unpacked. Chris, oblivious to my internal turmoil, wandered into the kitchen and opened the fridge. "You guys don't have much," he remarked casually, scanning the shelves. I noticed his fingers brushing against my meticulously labeled containers, leaving smudges on the glass. My stomach clenched. "Don't worry, John said, laughing lightly. We'll shop together. Make yourself at home. Chris nodded, dropping his bag by the foot of the guest bedroom bed. He flopped onto the couch in the living room and sighed, stretching as if he'd never felt comfortable anywhere before. I wanted to walk away, but my feet felt frozen to the floor. This was at our first real test. As the hours passed, I watched Chris make himself at home. He wandered from room to room, opening drawers and cabinets, testing the comfort of chairs, flipping through books that were on our shelves. Every movement seemed casual, natural, as if he had lived here before. I tried to remind myself that he was just hurting, just trying to heal. But my heart pounded with irritation at every careless gesture. The way he tossed his jacket on the dining chair instead of hanging it. The way he left a half-eaten snack on the kitchen counter. The smudge on the coffee table from his palm. Every small action felt like a violation of our sanctuary. By the evening, John and I sat in the living room. Chris sprawled lazily on the sofa, scrolling on his phone. I sipped my tea silently, attempting to calm the storm of thoughts swirling in my mind. See? He's fine, John said, glancing at me with an encouraging smile. It's not so bad, is it? I wanted to respond, to say that it was more than not so bad, that our home no longer felt like our own. But the words lodged in my throat. I didn't want to hurt John, didn't want to seem unkind. So I stayed silent, nodding faintly, while inside I felt the first real twinges of resentment. That night, as I lay in our bedroom, I thought about the months ahead. How many mornings would I wake up to find Chris in the kitchen, leaving crumbs behind? How many evenings would I have to tiptoe around him, adjust my habits, compromise my space? And worst of all, how long before John's unshakable generosity would override my own sense of comfort and peace? I realized then that this wasn't just about tidiness or minor annoyances. This was about control, about the balance of our new marriage, about the unspoken understanding that home is sacred and boundaries exist for a reason. And somewhere deep down, I knew that if I didn't speak up soon, I might lose more than just a clean house. I might lose the quiet, safe connection John and I had just begun to nurture. As Chris slept on the couch that night, the glow of the living room lamp casting a soft halo around him, I felt a pang of unease. The storm was no longer just in my mind. It had entered our home, and the calm I had cherished was under siege. I whispered silently to myself, I have to figure this out before it's too late. The first few days of Chris living with us passed in a blur of small irritations that piled up faster than I could imagine. I woke up to find his sneakers by the doorway, not in the designated shoe rack. I found his half-empty water glass on the coffee table, leaving tiny rings on the polished surface. Every small act chipped away at the careful order I had tried so hard to maintain. John seemed completely oblivious to the mounting chaos. It's fine, he would say, brushing aside my sighs. He's going through a tough time. He needs us. And he did. I couldn't deny that. I had seen the sadness in Chris's eyes, the slump in his shoulders, the way he sometimes stared blankly at nothing, lost in memory. My heart ached for him. But here was the problem. Our home, our sanctuary, our first space as a married couple, was being quietly dismantled. Every day, I found myself cleaning after Chris, straightening the living room, washing the dishes he had left in the sink, reorganizing the kitchen where he had rummaged through cabinets. It was never malicious. Chris simply didn't notice. But the responsibility fell entirely on me, and with every chore, my patience thinned. One evening, John returned home from work earlier than usual. Chris had been lounging on the couch, scrolling endlessly on his phone, when John walked in. Hey buddy, John greeted, ruffling Chris's hair. I made us some coffee, want some? I was in the kitchen, wiping down counters. I felt a sudden surge of irritation. Every little act of John's kindness toward Chris reminded me of how little attention he was paying to the disruption in our home. I wanted to speak, to explain, to make him see what I was feeling, but the words felt heavy, risky. I didn't want to hurt him, and I certainly didn't want to seem unkind to Chris. Later that night, I lay awake next to John, listening to the faint snores from Chris on the couch. I tried to breathe calmly, to remind myself that I was being patient, that this was temporary. But each creak from the living room, each shuffle of movement, reminded me that my calm was fragile. I remembered all the times John had laughed off Chris's messiness in the past. It's just a little mess, he'd said, smiling. It's nothing to worry about. But now, the little mess had a permanence to it. It wasn't a weekend visit. It was months of surrender. I thought about all the things we had worked for, the freshly painted walls, the new furniture, the perfect arrangement of our belongings. Each item had been chosen with care, meant to create a home, not a shared dormitory. And now, it felt like we were living in a compromise I hadn't agreed to. The real challenge wasn't just the mess, it was the shift in dynamics. Chris had become part of our daily rhythm, and I was constantly adjusting to him. John seemed to see nothing wrong, and that indifference hurt in ways I hadn't anticipated. I felt invisible in my own home, my opinions secondary to his generosity. By the end of the first week, the tension had reached a boiling point. I tried once more to have a conversation with John, carefully choosing my words. "I know you want to help, Chris," I said, "but I feel like our space, our home, our life together, is being compromised. I'm struggling to feel like this is really our home anymore." John looked at me, his smile fading. "I don't get it," he said quietly. "He's my friend. He needs me. Are you saying I can't help him?" "I'm saying," I replied, my voice steady despite the storm inside me, "that there has to be a balance. I can't lose our sense of home in the process of helping someone else." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, a soft, persistent reminder of the world beyond our walls. Inside, I felt the weight of unspoken rules, the delicate tension between love, friendship, and personal boundaries. And as I finally drifted off to sleep, the glow from the living room lamp casting shadows across the ceiling, I realized something important. This was more than just a test of patience. It was a test of our marriage, of how we would navigate life together when our values, priorities, and boundaries came into conflict. I didn't know how it would turn out, but I knew one thing: I had to stand firm. I had to protect the home John and I were building, even if it meant confronting uncomfortable truths, challenging my husband's generosity, and risking a temporary strain on our relationship. Because some things, some sacred spaces, weren't meant to be compromised, no matter how noble the intention. The second week of Chris living with us had begun, and already, the air in the house felt thick with tension. It wasn't loud or dramatic, it was the quiet, persistent kind that gnawed at the edges of everything. Every morning, I woke to find another little disruption: a mug left in the sink, a sock abandoned near the couch, crumbs on the counter that somehow multiplied overnight. Each of these small details, trivial to some, felt like a violation to me. John still seemed blissfully unaware of my growing frustration. He would smile at Chris as though nothing were amiss, patting his back, joking, and encouraging him to relax. "Don't worry about the dishes," John would say cheerfully. "I'll take care of them later," and later never came. Somehow, the responsibility fell entirely on me. I began to notice something else: how differently John and I saw generosity and boundaries. For John, helping a friend was non-negotiable. It was an act of loyalty, an instinct that had always defined him. But for me, generosity didn't mean surrendering my own needs, my own space, or the carefully cultivated peace of our home. I had never had to confront this kind of imbalance before, and it was unsettling. Chris, still fragile from his breakup, didn't intentionally create chaos. He simply existed in our space without consideration for our routines. I caught him one evening rummaging through the pantry, searching for snacks. He didn't ask, he didn't notice my presence. I wanted to speak up, but a part of me held back, part empathy, part fear of seeming unsupportive. That evening, I finally tried to express myself more clearly to John. "I know Chris needs help," I said, as we sat at the dining table with untouched plates from our quick dinner. "But having him here all the time, it's changing everything. Our home doesn't feel like ours anymore." John's brows furrowed slightly. "Changing everything? It's just a temporary arrangement. He's my friend. He needs a safe place, and we can give it to him." "I understand that," I replied, my voice tight, "but temporary is relative. Weeks have passed, and every day it feels like our space is slipping away. I'm constantly adjusting, compromising, and it's exhausting. I love him too, but I can't live like this indefinitely." John's gaze softened, but there was still a hint of frustration. "I just thought you'd understand. Helping a friend is part of life, part of what I value. Are you saying that's wrong?" "It's not wrong," I said, trying to choose my words carefully. "It's just, it shouldn't come at the cost of our first home, our first experience living together. We're newly married, John. This is our space, and I feel like I've lost it already." There was a long silence. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, brushing against the windows with a sound that seemed almost accusatory, reminding me of the fragility of my peace. Inside, the weight of unspoken words, unmet expectations, and contrasting priorities pressed down on both of us. Meanwhile, Chris was in the living room, absorbed in his phone. He laughed quietly at something online, completely unaware of the storm brewing in the room. I wanted to scream, not at him, not at John, but at the situation itself. My sanctuary, the one place I thought I could control, was slipping through my fingers. Over the next few days, the tension in the house seemed to intensify. Small arguments emerged over inconsequential things: who would do the dishes, where Chris should sit while John worked, the placement of chairs and cushions that Chris casually rearranged. Every discussion felt like walking on eggshells, every decision a negotiation between my desire for order and John's desire to be generous. Then came the first direct confrontation with Chris himself. I had found him sprawled across the sofa, a half-eaten sandwich in hand, crumbs falling onto the floor. "Chris," I said gently, trying to keep my tone light, "could you please try to keep the kitchen a little cleaner? It's hard to maintain everything when there's constant mess." Chris looked up, surprised. "Oh, sorry. I didn't realize." His tone was apologetic but casual, not malicious. I wanted to forgive him immediately, to let it slide. But the truth was, this was not a one-time incident, it was a pattern. And patterns, I realized, were harder to adjust than moments. John walked in just then. "Everything okay?" he asked, a hint of concern in his voice. "Yes," I said quickly, not wanting to make it seem like an attack. "Just minor things." John nodded, trusting Chris to understand, smiling in a way that made me feel unseen. That night, as I lay in bed, I realized that the real challenge wasn't Chris. It was the balance between love, friendship, and the sanctity of our first home. How could I assert my needs without hurting John? How could I protect our space without appearing selfish? Little did I know, the next week would force all of us to confront these questions head on, bringing friends, family, and old loyalties into the mix and testing our patience, empathy, and commitment to one another in ways I could never have imagined. By the middle of the second week, the situation at home had started to spill beyond our walls. Friends, acquaintances, and even family members began to weigh in, some siding with me, others siding with John, and some refusing to take sides at all, but commenting anyway. It started innocuously enough with a text from my sister Emily. "Hey, how's Chris doing? You're being so nice letting him stay, right?" I stared at the message, feeling a twinge of annoyance. My sister had always been supportive, but now, instead of asking how I felt, she was praising the generosity that was slowly consuming my peace of mind. I typed a cautious reply. "It's okay, but it's not easy. It's been a lot." Her response came almost immediately. "You're being too harsh. He's your husband's friend. People go through tough times. You'd want someone to help you too, wouldn't you?" I sighed, putting my phone down. It wasn't that I didn't understand empathy. I did. But no one was asking how I felt, or considering that our home, the first home John and I had built together, was suddenly shared with someone else. Someone whose habits conflicted with my own in every possible way. The next day, John's friends began to comment, one by one, in casual messages or over phone calls. "Chris really needs you guys right now. You can't turn your back on him. You've got to understand, he's not trying to be difficult." I read each message and felt a rising heat in my chest. It was like being caught between two worlds. On one side, my own needs for privacy, calm, and respect for our new life together. On the other, a chorus of voices insisting that generosity, loyalty, and compassion were the ultimate priorities. Then, my brother called. "Honestly, I think you're overreacting. It's not like he's a stranger. He's just a guy who needs a place for a few months. You can handle it." I ran my hands over my face, exhausted. Why was everyone seeing this as simple, when to me it was anything but? They hadn't walked in my shoes, hadn't felt the subtle erosion of order, hadn't experienced the small but constant stress of living with someone whose habits clashed with mine. Even John seemed affected by the external opinions, though differently. He appeared torn between his loyalty to Chris and his awareness of my growing frustration. Some days, he tried to mediate, gently asking, "Is it really that bad? Maybe I can adjust a few things." But adjustments didn't feel like solutions, they felt like compromises I hadn't agreed to. The real tipping point came during a casual gathering at a friend's house. A group of John's friends, including Chris's close acquaintances, were all discussing relationships, loyalty, and friendship. Chris mentioned casually that he was staying at our place for the foreseeable future, and several people immediately praised John for his generosity. "That's amazing," one friend said. "Most guys wouldn't take in a friend like that," another added. "You're a good friend, man. She should be proud." I felt a wave of irritation so intense it took my breath away. None of them asked how I felt. None of them considered that while John's act was kind, it was simultaneously infringing on my home, my life, and my sense of peace. Later that night, I confronted John quietly in our bedroom. "Do you see what I mean?" I asked. "Everyone is applauding your generosity, but no one is asking about me. No one is seeing how this affects our life." John looked down, his fingers tracing patterns on the comforter. "I know," he said softly, "but I thought you understood why I'm doing this. I didn't think it would feel like I was ignoring you." "It's not that I don't understand," I said, trying to steady my voice. I can't lose our home, John. Not now. Not when we're just starting our life together. I need you to see that." We fell into silence, the tension between us palpable. Outside, the wind rattled the window panes, a persistent reminder that life didn't pause for our discomfort. Inside, I realized that our marriage was now being tested not by anything dramatic, not by malice or betrayal, but by the collision of generosity, friendship, and the sanctity of home. As the night wore on, I reflected on my own emotions. Was I being too rigid, too selfish, or was it reasonable to protect the life we were building? The question haunted me, especially as I knew the coming weeks would force us all, John, Chris, and me, to navigate these treacherous waters together. The pressures from friends and family didn't lessen. Every comment, every suggestion, every congratulatory remark about John's kindness felt like a subtle push, nudging me toward compromise. I felt like I was balancing on a knife's edge, and I wasn't sure how long I could maintain that balance without snapping or giving into something I wasn't ready to accept. And yet, despite all the external voices, despite Chris's presence in our home, despite the tension that seemed to stretch like a taut string between John and me, a small part of me clung to hope that through communication, honesty, and patience, we could find a way to preserve our home, our marriage, and still help a friend in need without losing ourselves in the process. By the third week of Chris staying with us, the atmosphere in the house had shifted. It was subtle at first: a misplaced shoe, a crumpled napkin on the dining table, but the accumulation was relentless. Every day, I felt my carefully maintained sense of order eroding, replaced by a persistent anxiety that clung to me like a second skin. Chris had started to establish routines that were entirely incompatible with ours. Mornings were the worst. I would wake early, trying to enjoy a quiet cup of coffee, only to find Chris in the kitchen, flipping through cereal boxes and rummaging in the pantry, leaving a trail of crumbs in his wake. He hummed or muttered to himself, unaware of my presence or the growing irritation it sparked. John, as always, seemed oblivious. "He's just finding his footing," he said one morning, brushing past me with a gentle smile. "Give him time. He's had a rough few months." I wanted to shout, to scream, to let him know that my time, my comfort, and my home were being quietly invaded every single day. But I restrained myself, knowing that any confrontation with John could escalate into a fight that would leave us both hurt. Instead, I took a deep breath and tried to enforce small boundaries. "Chris," I said softly that morning, "can you please try to clean up after yourself? Even just a little?" Chris looked up, blinking in surprise. "Oh yeah, sure. I'm sorry." His voice was apologetic, but the action was fleeting. Within hours, dishes had piled up again, a shirt lay draped over the arm of the sofa, and crumbs traced a map across the counter. The real strain came in the evenings. I had begun to dread the time after work, when John would sit with Chris in the living room, laughing, joking, and catching up. I would stand in the kitchen, silently cleaning, observing their camaraderie with a mix of envy and resentment. It wasn't their friendship that bothered me, it was the way it displaced me. The way it made me feel peripheral in the life I had just begun to build. One night, after a particularly frustrating day, I decided to set firmer boundaries. I approached John while he was helping Chris with laundry, a task I had reluctantly let him handle. "John, I think we need to talk about how long Chris is staying," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. John looked up, a little defensive. "We already talked about this. He needs us, and he's just getting back on his feet. It won't be forever." I know that, I said, trying to be patient. But it's affecting our marriage. I feel like I don't have my own space anymore. Our home doesn't feel like ours. John sighed and rubbed his forehead. I want to help him. He's my friend. You know me. I can't just turn my back on him. I understand that, I said firmly. But there has to be balance. I can't keep living like this. I love him too. But this is our home. John, I need it to feel like home, not just a guest house. Chris, oblivious to the tension, wandered in at that moment, asking John for help with a video game on the TV. I clenched my fists, wanting to scream not at him, not at John but at the situation itself. The intrusion was relentless. My home, my sanctuary, my first space as a married woman, was being quietly dismantled, one casual act at a time. The next morning, I woke to find Chris in the middle of the living room, headphones on, laughing loudly at a show on his laptop. A plate with crumbs sat on the coffee table, and his socks were draped over the armrest. I felt the familiar surge of irritation. Every nerve in my body screamed for control, for order, for the home I had worked so hard to create. I decided to take action. I drafted a list of house rules, small and reasonable, designed to maintain cleanliness and respect our shared space. When John returned from work that evening, I handed it to him. I think we need a few guidelines, I said, trying to sound neutral. For everyone's comfort. John read it, his expression conflicted. I get it, he said finally, but it feels a little harsh. Chris is already vulnerable. I don't want to make him feel unwelcome. I'm not trying to make him feel unwelcome, I replied, trying to keep my tone even. I'm trying to protect our home and our marriage. There's a difference. Chris overheard the conversation and came into the room, holding a mug. Are we in trouble? He asked timidly. No, Chris, I said gently. We just need to make sure everyone respects the space we're sharing. It was a small victory, but the tension didn't disappear. Every day continued to test my patience. A jacket left on the couch, a sandwich wrapper on the counter, the faint but persistent feeling that our home no longer belonged solely to John and me. I had to navigate my frustration carefully, balancing empathy for Chris with the need to preserve my home and my sanity. By the end of the week, the strain had reached its peak. The house felt smaller, the air heavier, and my patience thinner than ever. I realized that helping a friend in need was admirable, but not at the cost of your own well-being or the foundation of your marriage. Chris wasn't malicious, John wasn't inconsiderate, and I wasn't unreasonable. But the collision of these forces created a tension that no one could ignore, and as I lay in bed that night, listening to Chris snore softly in the living room, I understood something critical. In order to maintain the life John and I were building, I would have to confront not only Chris's habits, but also the unspoken priorities that threatened to redefine our home. By the end of the third week, the tension in our home had become almost unbearable. Every room seemed to hum with silent conflict. Every corner whispered frustration. I could no longer ignore it. Something had to change. One Saturday morning, Chris had left a pile of dishes in the sink again, and his jacket was draped across the dining chair. I had counted 4 crumbs on the counter just that morning. I tried to take a deep breath and remind myself to be patient. But patience had its limits. I decided it was time for a direct conversation, a confrontation not born of anger, but of necessity. I called John into the kitchen. John, we need to talk, I said, my voice calm but firm. John glanced at me, sensing the seriousness. Okay, what's on your mind? It's about Chris, I said. I can't keep living like this. Our home feels less like ours every day, and it's affecting both my peace of mind and our relationship. John's expression softened, but there was a hint of defensiveness. I know, but I don't want him to feel unwelcome. He's going through a lot. I understand that, I said quickly, but there has to be balance. Helping a friend doesn't mean losing our home, our privacy, or our marriage. Chris needs to respect our space, and we need to set clear boundaries now. John nodded slowly. Okay, I get it. What do you want me to do? I took a deep breath and turned to Chris, who had entered the kitchen, looking slightly apprehensive. Chris, I know you're going through a tough time, I said gently, and we want to help. But we also need our home to feel like home. That means cleaning up after yourself, respecting our space, and following some basic guidelines. While you're here, Chris blinked, slightly embarrassed, but nodded. Yeah, I get it. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to make things difficult. I smiled softly, trying to convey empathy while maintaining firmness. We know you didn't, but we all need to live together respectfully. John and I are a team, and our home is important to us. Can you commit to that? Yes, Chris said quietly. I'll do my best. John placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. See, it's not about being unkind. It's about making sure everyone feels comfortable. For the first time in weeks, I felt a weight lift from my chest. The confrontation hadn't been easy, but it had been necessary. I realized that setting boundaries wasn't selfish, it was an act of self-respect and protection for my marriage. Over the next few days, the change was subtle but noticeable. Chris began cleaning up after himself more consistently, putting his belongings in designated areas, and respecting our space. John was careful to mediate without undermining the boundaries we had established. And I felt a renewed sense of control and calm in our home, knowing that my voice and needs had been heard and respected. That evening, as I sat in the living room with John, I reflected on the past few weeks. The experience had been challenging, yes, but it had also strengthened our communication and understanding of each other. We had learned that generosity and empathy must coexist with boundaries and respect, and that a marriage could survive even the most delicate of intrusions if both partners were willing to communicate openly and honestly. I looked at John and smiled. Thank you, I said softly. For what? He asked, puzzled. For helping me protect our home and for understanding me, I replied. He leaned over and kissed my forehead. Always, he said. We're a team. No one comes before us, not even Chris. We'll help him, but we'll also take care of ourselves. In that moment, I realized that a home isn't just a place, it's a reflection of balance, respect, and love. And with communication, patience, and honesty, even the most complicated situations can find their way to harmony. The following week brought a new kind of tension, one that wasn't about crumbs, dishes, or clutter. This was the subtle, insidious kind that worked its way into thoughts, conversations, and feelings. Chris was trying, truly he was. He cleaned up more consistently, placed his belongings in designated spots, and even tried to help with chores occasionally. But despite the improvements, the emotional ripple effect of his presence was undeniable. I noticed it in John first. He would glance at me during conversations with Chris, sometimes hesitating before responding, as though torn between his loyalty to his friend and his partnership with me. I understood, intellectually, that this was complicated. John had known Chris for years. But emotionally, I felt as though my role in our home was being subtly diminished. One afternoon, Chris approached John in the living room. Hey man, thanks for letting me stay. I don't know what I would have done otherwise, he said, his voice quiet, almost reverent. John smiled warmly, ruffling Chris's hair. Don't mention it. You're like family here. I was in the kitchen, unloading groceries, listening to the exchange. My chest tightened. It wasn't jealousy in the traditional sense, not exactly. It was the feeling that the bond between John and Chris, long-standing and familiar, was intruding into the delicate, newly formed bond that John and I were building as a married couple. That evening, I confronted John gently. Do you realize how much time and attention you give Chris? I asked, keeping my tone calm. I feel like I'm competing for a place in our home, and it's exhausting. John looked surprised, but not defensive. I didn't realize you felt that way. I thought I was just helping him, being a friend. I never wanted you to feel like you're competing. It's not about competing, I said, trying to articulate the complex tangle of emotions. It's about feeling like my home, our home, belongs to us. And right now, it doesn't feel entirely that way. John took a deep breath, sitting down across from me. I get it, he said softly. I think maybe I got carried away with wanting to help him. I didn't think about how it would make you feel. I'm sorry. His apology softened the edges of my frustration, but it didn't erase the underlying tension. Chris's presence, his needs, and the external opinions from friends and family had created a delicate balancing act that I hadn't anticipated when John first suggested helping him. The next day, Chris came to me with a request, oblivious to the lingering tension. Hey, would it be okay if I used your laptop for a few hours? I need to update my resume, he asked, eyes hopeful. I hesitated, measuring my response. I wanted to be kind, supportive, but I also wanted to maintain boundaries. Sure, I said finally, placing it on the table. Just make sure to log out when you're done, okay? Chris nodded eagerly, grateful. As I watched him type, a thought occurred to me. This situation wasn't just about cleanliness or space, it was about balance, respect, and understanding in all its forms. Helping someone in need was important, but it should not come at the expense of the home you're building, the relationship you're nurturing, or your own mental well-being. That night, John and I talked again, this time in the quiet of our bedroom. I think I understand more now, John said, taking my hand. I can be a friend to Chris without letting it overwhelm us. I just don't want him to feel abandoned. You won't abandon him, I said. We'll help him, but we have to do it on our terms without losing our own space or peace. That's fair, isn't it? John nodded, a look of relief and resolve crossing his face. Yes, that's fair. We'll figure it out together. As I lay in bed that night, listening to the faint hum of the city outside our windows, I felt a cautious sense of hope. Chris's presence was still a challenge, and the weeks ahead would test our patience, empathy, and communication skills. But for the first time, I felt that a balance was possible, a way to support a friend without sacrificing the foundation of our home and marriage. And deep down, I knew that this delicate equilibrium, once achieved, would not only strengthen our relationship with Chris, but also fortify the bond between John and me, preparing us for the inevitable challenges that life as a married couple would bring. By the middle of the 4th week, the emotional tension that had been quietly simmering erupted in small but undeniable confrontations. Chris, despite his efforts to be considerate, had moments of forgetfulness that clashed with my sense of order. John, caught between his loyalty to his longtime friend and his commitment to me, tried to mediate, but sometimes that only made the situation more complex. It started with something trivial, a coffee cup left on the counter. Chris had left it the night before, intending to wash it later. But in the morning, I found it, and something inside me snapped. Chris, I said firmly, though not unkindly, please clean up after yourself. This is our home, and it's important that everyone respects that. Chris looked up, startled. Oh, yeah, sorry. I'll do it now. I appreciate that, I said, but my tone carried the frustration I had been bottling up for weeks. John, who had just walked in, gave me a look that tried to balance concern and caution. I know it's frustrating, but let's not make it bigger than it is, he said softly. It's not just this, I replied, my voice steadier now. It's the constant accumulation of small things. Every day, there's something new. I'm feeling invisible in my own home. John's expression faltered. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Chris, sensing the tension, stood quietly, hands in pockets, unsure how to respond. The next day, the pressure from friends and family intensified. My sister texted again. You need to be more understanding. Chris is going through a hard time. Everyone deserves support. Meanwhile, John's friends chimed in. You're a good friend, man. Don't let her make you feel guilty for helping someone who needs it. Each message felt like a subtle attack on my perspective. A reminder that while I was striving to protect our home and marriage, everyone else seemed to applaud John's generosity without considering my experience. That evening, after John and I finished dinner, I confronted him directly. Do you see what's happening? I asked. All these people are pressuring us, praising your generosity, but no one is asking how I feel. No one is considering what I need in our home. John looked down, silent for a moment, then met my eyes. I know, he said quietly. I think, maybe I didn't realize how much this was affecting you emotionally. I want to help him. I want to be a good friend. And I understand that, I said. But helping a friend shouldn't mean sacrificing our peace, our boundaries, and the home we're building together. We have to find a way to support him without losing ourselves. Chris, who had been quietly listening from the doorway, finally spoke. I didn't mean to make things so hard. I really appreciate everything you've done for me. I'll try harder. The sincerity in his voice softened the tension, but it didn't erase the weeks of stress. I realized that while Chris's presence had been challenging, the real struggle was balancing empathy, loyalty, and personal boundaries. Over the next few days, we implemented a system, clear house rules, designated spaces for Chris, and scheduled times for chores and shared activities. John made an effort to communicate more with me about decisions affecting the household, and Chris began taking initiative to respect the boundaries we had set. The change was gradual, but noticeable. I felt a renewed sense of control and calm in our home, and John and I began to reconnect emotionally. acknowledging the strain we had endured and committing to navigating future challenges as a team. By the end of the week, a tentative equilibrium had been restored. Chris's presence was still a part of our lives, but it no longer dominated our emotional landscape. We had learned that communication, empathy, and firm boundaries were essential to maintaining balance, whether dealing with friends, family, or the intricacies of our own marriage. As the weeks passed, the initial tension from Chris's presence slowly transformed into a more nuanced dynamic. While the house rules and clear boundaries had helped reduce the overt conflicts, the emotional layers were more complex. I realized that this wasn't just about cleanliness or space, it was about the invisible bonds, loyalties, and expectations that intertwined between John, Chris, and myself. Chris, despite his struggles, began to take more initiative. He cleaned up after himself without being asked, learned where his personal space ended, and even started helping with small chores when he noticed I was overwhelmed. Watching him navigate these responsibilities reminded me that his past difficulties didn't define him, it was his willingness to adjust that mattered. John, on the other hand, was learning to mediate without losing his identity as a loyal friend. He would check in with me before making decisions that affected the household, asking, "Is this okay? Or do you mind if I help him with this?" These small gestures were monumental, showing that while he valued friendship deeply, he valued our marriage just as much. I, too, was learning a lot about patience and perspective. I realized that my own instinct to control the environment stemmed from a desire for order, security, and predictability in my newly established married life. But life, I was discovering, didn't always follow those rules. Flexibility, compromise, and empathy were just as vital. One evening, the three of us found ourselves in the living room together. Chris was quietly reading on the sofa, John was fixing a small shelf in the corner, and I was organizing some papers. It was the first time in weeks that the house felt calm and cooperative. I decided to break the silence. "Chris," I began, "I want to thank you for making an effort. I know it hasn't been easy living here, and I appreciate that you've tried to respect our space." Chris looked up, a slight smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Thank you. I really do want to make this work. I've been a bit of a mess, I know, but I'm trying." John leaned back, glancing between us. "We're all learning, right? None of this is perfect, but I think we're getting there." That night, I reflected on the evolution of our household. The early weeks had been fraught with tension, misunderstandings, and emotional strain, but through communication, honesty, and mutual respect, we had carved out a new equilibrium, a shared life that balanced friendship, loyalty, and personal boundaries. It became clear that the most challenging part wasn't setting rules, it was navigating the emotional terrain of relationships. Chris's presence had forced us to confront questions about generosity, priorities, and empathy. It had tested our ability to communicate clearly and act with integrity, and in doing so, it had strengthened the bonds between John and me. Outside influences, the opinions of friends and family continued to trickle in, but they no longer carried the same weight. We had established our own framework, our own standards for what felt right in our home. I realized that external judgment could never substitute for internal clarity. By the end of part 3C, a rhythm had formed. Chris had his place, John and I had ours, and the house had become a space where boundaries were respected, friendships were honored, and our marriage remained central. It wasn't perfect, and there would still be challenges ahead, but the foundation had been set. For the first time since Chris had moved in, I felt a sense of confidence and calm. I knew that the upcoming weeks would bring new situations, perhaps new tests of patience or understanding, but now, we were equipped to handle them. And in that quiet moment, I allowed myself to appreciate how far we had come as a household, as friends, and as a couple. The tension that had been simmering for weeks finally reached a point where it could no longer be ignored. Even with boundaries and mutual respect, the emotional weight of Chris living with us still lingered. That weekend, I realized that the next step required a more honest, direct conversation, a moment where feelings, expectations, and limits had to be laid bare. Chris was in the living room, quietly sketching in his notebook, headphones around his neck. John was tidying up some books on the shelves, glancing occasionally at Chris. I took a deep breath and sat down across from them. "I want to talk," I began. My voice was calm but firm. "This isn't about blame. It's about clarity. boundaries, and understanding where we stand as a household. Chris looked up, a little nervous. Okay, John turned to me, his expression soft but serious. I'm listening. I spoke slowly, deliberately. Chris, you're going through a rough time, and I want to support you. But this is our home. John and I built this space together. I need to make sure our life, our marriage, and our routines are protected. That means there are some clear expectations while you stay here. Chris nodded, absorbing every word. I understand. I really don't want to make things harder for you guys. I know, I said gently, and I appreciate that. That's why we set rules, shared spaces, and expectations. But there's another piece. I want you to start thinking about a timeline. This isn't forever. We can't pause our lives indefinitely. John reached over and placed a reassuring hand on Chris's shoulder. She's right. We care about you, and will support you. But part of that support is helping you take the next steps, so we all can maintain balance in our lives. Chris looked at both of us, a mixture of gratitude and apprehension in his eyes. Yeah, I think I get it. I need to take responsibility, not just for myself, but for respecting your life too. For the first time in weeks, I felt a shift in the energy of the room. The tension that had been pervasive seemed to lift slightly. We weren't perfect, and we weren't finished navigating the situation, but at that moment, we had achieved clarity. I smiled softly. Thank you, both of you. This isn't easy, and I know emotions have been high, but by being honest and respecting each other, we can make this work for now. John nodded, and Chris offered a small, sincere smile. The three of us sat in silence for a moment, letting the acknowledgement of boundaries and mutual respect settle. It was a quiet victory, but a profound one. Over the following days, Chris started actively working on his plan. He updated his resume, applied for jobs, and even looked into temporary housing options, all while continuing to respect our home and routines. John and I communicated more openly, regularly checking in about feelings, boundaries, and adjustments. That weekend, we celebrated a small milestone, the first dinner in weeks where the house felt genuinely harmonious. Chris cleaned up after himself without reminder. John engaged in casual conversation, and I felt a sense of peace returning to my home. It wasn't the end of challenges. Chris's recovery and reintegration into independent life would take time, but it was a turning point. We had survived the intense initial weeks, established boundaries, and proven that communication, empathy, and honesty could navigate even complicated emotional landscapes. As I reflected that night, I realized that this experience had taught me invaluable lessons. Generosity and loyalty are important, but so are boundaries and self-respect. Love, patience, and empathy must coexist with clear communication and personal integrity. And above all, a home is a sanctuary, but only when all who inhabit it respect the balance between support and autonomy. The first morning of the new month felt different. The house no longer carried the subtle hum of tension that had dominated the past weeks. Chris had been making strides toward independence, applying for jobs, looking for apartments, and taking personal responsibility for his habits at home. The small victories, the clean kitchen in the morning, the neatly arranged living room, the courteous gestures toward both John and me made a tangible difference in the atmosphere. I walked through the kitchen, sipping my coffee, and noticed Chris quietly washing the dishes from the previous night. He hummed a soft tune, absorbed in his task, and for a moment, I realized how far he had come. Morning, I said lightly, smiling. Chris looked up, a small smile tugging at his lips. Morning, coffee? I nodded, appreciating the casual normalcy. There was no tension, no guilt, no subtle battle over space or respect. Just a shared home, functioning with boundaries intact. John joined us, carrying a stack of mail. Looks like we have a busy weekend ahead, he said. His eyes met mine, and I felt that familiar warmth, the reassurance that we were a team, able to navigate challenges together. The past weeks had tested every aspect of our lives: patience, communication, empathy, and boundaries. But through it all, I realized something crucial. Balance was not a static state. It was an ongoing process, a daily choice to respect ourselves and others while maintaining harmony in our relationships. Chris approached, holding a small notebook. I found an apartment I like, he said, excitement and nervousness mingling in his tone. It's not far from here. I think I can move in next month. A wave of relief washed over me. Not because I didn't care about Chris or his well-being, but because we had reached a point where independence, respect, and boundaries coexisted. I smiled warmly. "That's great, Chris," I said sincerely. "I'm really proud of you. And I'm glad we were able to figure this out together." John clapped a hand on Chris's shoulder. "I'm proud too. You've done the work, and now you get your own space." It was a moment of quiet celebration, a recognition of growth, perseverance, and mutual respect. For the first time since Chris had moved in, I felt that our household was truly balanced, our home a space where kindness and boundaries coexisted, where friendship and marriage thrived alongside each other. As the day unfolded, I realized that this experience had reshaped my understanding of empathy and generosity. Helping a friend in need was important, yes, but it was equally important to protect the life and marriage you had built. Clear communication, honesty, and boundaries were not just tools, they were acts of love. By the evening, the house was calm. Chris was planning his apartment hunt online. John was organizing some files for work, and I sat quietly, reflecting on the journey. The tension, the conflicts, and the difficult conversations had all been necessary. They had tested our patience, sharpened our empathy, and ultimately, strengthened the bonds that mattered most between John and me. And with the friend we had supported, for the first time in weeks, I could truly relax. The home that once felt invaded now felt harmonious. The laughter, the quiet routines, and the mutual respect had returned. Life was far from perfect, but it was ours, balanced, respectful, and full of the lessons we had learned together. The day Chris finally moved out arrived with a mixture of relief, pride, and bittersweet emotion. The house, which had once been tense and chaotic, now felt alive with calm and balance. Boxes were stacked neatly in his car, and he had managed to secure an apartment just a short drive away. I stood in the living room, watching Chris carry the last box, reflecting on the past 2 months. The journey had been challenging, yes, but it had transformed all of us. Chris had grown more self-reliant, John and I had strengthened our communication, and the house had become a home again, a sanctuary of respect, boundaries, and love. "Thanks for everything," Chris said, setting down the final box. "I really couldn't have done this without you both. I promise to stay in touch, and I'll make sure to visit in a way that doesn't cause trouble." I smiled, genuinely moved. "We're proud of you, Chris. You've worked hard, and we're happy to see you taking this step. Remember, boundaries are important, but so is knowing you're supported." John clapped him on the shoulder, his familiar warmth evident. "You're part of our lives, Chris, but now it's time to thrive independently." As Chris drove away, I felt an unexpected sense of closure. The house no longer carried the weight of unresolved tension. Instead, it was filled with the quiet knowledge that challenges could be navigated, boundaries could be respected, and relationships, no matter how complicated, could survive with honesty and empathy. That evening, John and I sat together on the couch, a rare moment of calm and reflection. "It's finally just us again," I said softly. John smiled, intertwining our fingers. "Yes, and I think we're stronger for it. We learned a lot about communication, about empathy, and about maintaining balance between helping others and protecting our own lives." I nodded, feeling the weight of relief and gratitude. The experience with Chris had not only tested our patience, but also deepened our understanding of each other. We had faced the challenge together and emerged more connected, more respectful, and more aware of the delicate balance required to nurture a marriage. Over the next few days, the home settled into its natural rhythm. Meals were shared, laughter returned, and the small routines we had built as a couple resumed without interference. The lessons of the past weeks lingered, quietly guiding us in maintaining harmony and mutual respect. As I reflected on the journey, I realized the truth in what I had learned. Generosity and kindness toward others are vital, but they must coexist with boundaries and self-respect. Homes are sanctuaries, and marriage is a partnership that requires clear communication, empathy, and a willingness to stand firm when necessary. Chris's departure marked not an end, but a culmination of growth for him, for John, and for me. And as the sun set over our quiet, balanced home, I felt a profound sense of peace. Life was full of challenges, but together, with respect, honesty, and love, we were capable of navigating them all. Our journey had tested the limits of patience and empathy, but it had also revealed the resilience of relationships built on communication, mutual understanding, and unwavering support. And in that harmony, we found the true meaning of home.